Eleanor, 78 years old and widowed for nearly a decade, lived a quiet, solitary life in the countryside. Her days were predictable, often filled with tending her flower garden, sipping tea by the window, or losing herself in the comforting rustle of old books. But her nights were becoming anything but ordinary. It started on a cold December evening when the wind howled against the walls of her small, cozy cottage. As the embers in her fireplace dimmed, she drifted into a sleep so deep it felt like she had stepped into another world. In the dream, Henry, her late husband of 50 years, stood before her, not as the frail man he had been in his final days, but as the vibrant, strong figure she had fallen in love with all those years ago. He was dressed in the navy blue sweater she had knitted for him their first Christmas together, his face radiant with the same warm smile that could ease her worries with a single glance. At first, the dream seemed like a bittersweet memory replaying itself, but then it changed. Henry's expression wasn't peaceful. It was urgent. He gestured toward her, his lips moving, but the words were muffled, as if carried by a distant wind. Eleanor tried to step closer to reach for him, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. She awoke with a start, her heart pounding, the remnants of his voice echoing faintly in her mind. She dismissed it as her imagination, a longing for the man she had loved so deeply and lost too soon. But the dream returned the next night, and then the night after that. Each time, Henry appeared clearer, his gestures more deliberate, his eyes filled with an intensity she couldn't ignore. On the third night, she heard one word distinctly through the haze: "Find." The sound jolted her awake, and she sat in bed, clutching the quilt they had shared for decades, her mind racing. Find what? Or who? The question lingered like the faint scent of his cologne that still clung to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a dream. It was too vivid, too alive. She confided in her best friend, Martha, over their usual Tuesday afternoon tea. "It's grief," Martha said matter-of-factly, stirring sugar into her cup. "These things come and go. You've just buried it all these years, and now it's bubbling up." But Eleanor wasn't convinced. Grief didn't explain the clarity of Henry's voice or the strange sense of purpose that accompanied the dreams. She started a journal, jotting down every detail she could remember the moment she woke up. The sound of Henry's voice, the way his hand pointed towards something just out of her sight, the colors of the sky in the dream, even the faint aroma of pine that seemed to linger in the air. Every night brought more fragments, a distant bell ringing, the flutter of birds overhead, and Henry's eyes locking with hers, filled with a plea she couldn't yet decipher. By the second week, the dreams began to consume her waking hours. She would sit by the window, staring at the frost-covered fields, replaying each moment in her mind. She found herself whispering his name into the quiet house, as if hoping he might respond. "What do you want me to find, Henry?" she asked aloud one evening, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and desperation. The turning point came during the third week. In this dream, Henry was no longer simply standing before her. He was reaching out, his hand stretched toward her with a sense of urgency that left no room for doubt. She tried to grab his hand, but just as her fingers brushed against his, she woke with a gasp. For the first time, she wasn't scared. She felt a strange, unexplainable resolve. The next morning, as she folded her quilt and set the kettle on the stove, she whispered into the silence of her cottage, "I'm ready, Henry. Show me." For the first time since his passing, the weight of loneliness began to lift, replaced by a flicker of purpose. Whatever Henry was trying to tell her, she would find it, even if it meant facing the past she had locked away in the quiet corners of her heart. That night, as she drifted into sleep, a strange calm washed over her. The dream came again, and this time, as Henry pointed to the horizon, Eleanor felt the first hint of understanding. He wasn't just a memory. He was leading her to something that could change everything. Eleanor's nights became a patchwork of vivid, otherworldly experiences that blurred the lines between dreams and reality. Each time Henry appeared, his gestures grew more precise, his movements deliberate, as though he were trying to guide her step by step. It was the fourth week when she began to notice patterns, subtle, almost imperceptible connections between the fragments of her dreams. The word find echoed often, but now it was joined by images. A tall oak tree she recognized from her childhood, a brass key glinting in the sunlight, and a melody, faint but familiar, that lingered in her ears even after she woke. At first, Eleanor dismissed these as coincidences, figments of her imagination conjured by her yearning for Henry. But the dreams wouldn't let her rest. One morning, as the early sunlight filtered through the lace curtains, she sat at her dining table with her journal, flipping through its pages, tracing the scribbled notes she had made each night. There it was again, the oak tree, the key, the melody. A memory stirred at the edges of her mind, elusive and tantalizing. She closed her eyes, trying to summon it, but it slipped away like smoke through her fingers. That afternoon, she walked to the attic, her steps hesitant yet determined. The attic was a place she rarely ventured. It had been Henry's domain, a space filled with old tools, boxes of photographs, and forgotten mementos of their life together. The air was thick with dust and the scent of aged wood, and as she climbed the creaking stairs, a wave of nostalgia washed over her. She paused at the top, her hand gripping the rail, her breath shallow. "Why am I here?" she whispered to herself, but the question felt rhetorical. She knew why. The dreams had led her here. As she stepped into the dimly lit attic, the first thing she noticed was the silence, thick, almost oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that seemed to listen, as though the space itself were waiting for her to act. Her eyes scanned a room, her gaze landing on a stack of old trunks in the corner. She walked over, her heart pounding, and knelt before the largest one. It was Henry's favorite, a sturdy, leather-bound chest that he had once told her was his keeper of secrets. Eleanor hesitated, her hand hovering over the latch. A part of her feared what she might find. The other part, the one that had been dreaming of Henry every night, dared her to continue. With trembling fingers, she opened the chest. Inside, she found a collection of neatly stacked letters, yellow with age, tied together with twine. Beneath them was an assortment of photographs, some familiar, others not. But it was the object at the bottom of the chest that caught her attention, a small ornate box locked with a brass keyhole. Her breath hitched as she reached for it. The smooth would cool against her palms. The box was no larger than a book, but it felt heavy, as though it contained something more than its size suggested. She tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. The brass keyhole glinted in the dim light, and she immediately thought of the key from her dream. Eleanor sat back on her heels, staring at a box, her mind racing. The dreams weren't just pulling her toward memories. They were pointing her to something real. The oak tree, the brass key, the melody. These weren't random images. They were pieces of a puzzle, clues Henry was leaving for her from beyond the veil of sleep. That night, as she lay in bed, the box resting on her nightstand, she felt a strange mix of anticipation and fear. She drifted into sleep, and Henry appeared once more, standing beneath the oak tree, the brass key dangling from his hand. This time, his voice was clearer than ever. "You're so close," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You'll understand soon." When she awoke, Eleanor's heart was pounding. She glanced at the box, now bathed in the soft glow of morning light. She knew what she had to do. The dreams weren't just messages. They were a map, guiding her towards something Henry wanted her to find. Something she was destined to uncover. The small, locked box consumed Eleanor's thoughts. It sat on her nightstand like a secret begging to be revealed, its brass keyhole glinting in the morning light. For days, she carried it with her around the house, placing it beside her while she had her tea, setting it carefully on the counter as she baked bread, even holding it in her lap as she watched the flames dance in the fireplace. Each time she touched it, a flicker of something, curiosity, fear, or perhaps both, coursed through her. The brass key from her dream was the missing piece, but where was she supposed to find it? Her journal became her guide, a roadmap of the dreams that seemed to grow more vivid and intricate with each passing night. Henry appeared again and again, his presence more tangible than ever. This time, he wasn't alone in the dreams. The oak tree loomed in the background, its branches swaying in an unseen breeze, and the faint melody she'd been hearing grew louder, more distinct. It was a tune she recognized now, a lullaby he used to hum softly when they were first married. The memory of it stirred a deep ache in her chest, a mix of longing and love, so profound it left her breathless. Determined to follow the clues, Eleanor ventured into the attic once more. The air was thick with the scent of time, aged paper, worn wood, and the faint musk of forgotten things. She sifted through old trunks, her hands brushing against photo albums, loose papers, and Henry's collection of handwritten journals. Nothing seemed to connect to the box, but the melody from her dreams played faintly in her mind, urging her on. Then, in the corner of the attic, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. A small, intricately carved chest sat tucked behind a stack of old newspapers. Her heart raced as she pulled it free, the carvings on its surface matching the delicate designs on the box she had found earlier. She opened it cautiously, her breath catching as she discovered its contents. Inside was a single envelope, yellow with age and sealed with wax. Beneath it lay a key, small, brass, and unmistakably the one from her dream. Her fingers trembled as she picked up the key, the weight of it in her hand oddly reassuring. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, the golden metal catching the slanted sunlight streaming through the attic window. Henry had placed this here for her to find, she was certain of it now. This wasn't just a coincidence or a trick of the mind. The dreams were guiding her to something Henry had left behind, something he couldn't share with her while he was alive. With the key clutched tightly in her hand, Eleanor carried the box downstairs. She sat at the dining table, the envelope and the box in front of her, the key resting in her palm. She hesitated, her thoughts racing. What if whatever was inside the box changed everything she thought she knew about Henry? About their life together? She couldn't shake the feeling that opening, it would set something in motion that she couldn't undo. "Henry," she whispered into the quiet room, her voice barely audible. "What are you trying to tell me?" The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memories, of laughter, of whispered conversations late at night, of the love they had shared so deeply it still lingered in the walls of this house. Taking a deep breath, she inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the smooth click of the mechanism sending a shiver down her spine. When she opened the box, her breath caught in her throat. Inside was a collection of items so personal, so intimate, that tears sprang to her eyes. There was a bundle of letters, tied together with a faded blue ribbon, and a photograph she had never seen before, Henry, standing with a young woman she didn't recognize, his arm draped around her shoulders. Eleanor's heart pounded as she studied the photo. Who was this woman, and why had Henry kept this hidden from her? Beneath the letters and the photograph was a small, folded piece of paper. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the words written in Henry's unmistakable handwriting. "Eleanor, if you found this, it means I couldn't tell you the truth while I was alive. But you deserve to know. Everything I've done, I did out of love for you and for her." Her hand shook as she placed the note down on the table. Her mind raced with questions, but one thing was clear. Henry had kept a secret, one so important that he had orchestrated these dreams to lead her to this moment. The melody she had been hearing played softly in her mind again, and for the first time she realized it wasn't just a lullaby. It was a message, a call to action. As the evening sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the room, Eleanor sat in silence, staring at the box and its contents. She felt as though she had crossed a threshold, stepping into a story she didn't fully understand yet but couldn't turn away from. The answers she sought were out there, somewhere beyond her quiet life in the countryside, waiting for her to uncover them. Eleanor stared at the letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, her fingers hovering over them as though touching them might disturb the delicate balance of her world. Each letter represented a piece of a story she hadn't known existed, a narrative that Henry had kept hidden from her during their 50 years together. The photograph of Henry and the unfamiliar woman weighed heavily in her thoughts, the image both haunting and compelling. The note's cryptic words echoed in her mind. Everything I've done, I did out of love for you and for her. Who was she? And why hadn't Henry told her the truth? Summoning her courage, Eleanor untied the ribbon and carefully unfolded the first letter. Henry's handwriting greeted her, steady, deliberate, unmistakable. Her heart clenched as she read the salutation, "My dearest Eleanor." The words flowed with the tenderness she knew so well, but there was a weight to them, as though Henry had poured his heart into the page with the knowledge that he could never say these things to her face. The letter began with an apology, one so deeply felt that Eleanor could almost hear Henry's voice speaking the words. He wrote of his love for her, a love that had sustained him through every trial, every hardship. But then the tone shifted. Henry confessed that before he met Eleanor, his life had taken a path he hadn't been proud of, a path that had left him with unfinished business he could never resolve in his lifetime. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the next part. Henry wrote of a woman he had loved before her, a woman named Margaret. They had met during his youth, long before Eleanor had entered his life, and their love had been as intense as it was brief. Henry explained that Margaret had disappeared one day, leaving behind a single, life-altering truth: she was pregnant with his child. Eleanor's breath caught, and she pressed a hand to her chest. Henry had a child she had never known about. The room seemed to tilt, the walls closing in as the weight of his confession settled over her. Henry went on to explain that he had searched for Margaret and the child for years, but his efforts had been fruitless. When he met Eleanor, he had been so captivated by her kindness, her laughter, and the light she brought into his life that he made the decision to let the past remain in the past. But Henry hadn't forgotten. His words on the page revealed a man torn by guilt, a man who had spent his life wondering what had become of his child and whether he had done the right thing in keeping the secret from Eleanor. "I wanted to tell you," he wrote, "but every time I tried, I saw the joy in your eyes, and I couldn't bear the thought of shattering it. You deserve a life without the weight of my mistakes." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face as she read his final plea. "If you found this letter, it means you've uncovered the truth I could never bring myself to share. I don't know what you'll find, but please, Eleanor, don't let my mistakes define how you see me. I loved you with every fiber of my being, but I need you to know the full story of who I was and who I am." The letter slipped from Eleanor's hands and floated to the table. She sat back in her chair, staring at the words that had appended everything she thought she knew about her husband and their life together. Henry's secret wasn't just about a child. It was about a choice he had made to protect her, to shield her from a past he couldn't change. But in doing so, he had carried the burden alone, a burden that had followed him even into death. Eleanor's mind raced with questions. Where was this child now? Did they even know Henry existed? And what about Margaret? Had she told her child about him, or had she kept his identity a secret? A wave of anger rose within her, directed not at Henry, but at the unfairness of it all. He had left her to deal with the fallout, to grapple with a truth that had remained buried for decades. But beneath the anger was something else, a flicker of determination. Henry's dreams weren't just an apology, they were a call to action. He had led her to this discovery because he wanted her to finish what he couldn't. Eleanor didn't know where this journey would take her, but one thing was clear: she couldn't ignore the truth. That night, as she prepared for bed, she placed the letters and photograph back in the box and set it on her nightstand. The melody from her dreams played faintly in her mind, soothing her, urging her forward. When she drifted into sleep, Henry appeared once more, his expression softer this time, his voice clearer. "You're stronger than you think," he said, his gaze steady. "You'll know what to do." Eleanor woke with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in years. Henry's words lingered in her thoughts as she sat at the kitchen table, sipping her morning tea. She didn't know where to begin, but she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't just searching for answers. She was searching for a connection, a way to bring together the pieces of Henry's life and honor the love they had shared. She didn't know what she would find, but she was ready to face it, no matter how difficult the path ahead might be. The revelation weighed heavily on Eleanor's heart, but also lit a fire of determination within her. She couldn't let the story end with a hidden box and unread letters. Henry had left her this truth for a reason, and she owed it to him and to herself to uncover the rest of the story. The photograph of Henry with a mysterious woman and his confession about their child haunted her thoughts. Who were they? Where were they? And what had become of the child who shared Henry's blood but had never known his presence? Eleanor began with the letters. Each one was like a thread in a tapestry, weaving together fragments of Henry's untold past. Most were addressed to Margaret, written in a voice Eleanor recognized, but with a vulnerability she had never seen before. Henry poured his heart into those pages, expressing regret for his mistakes and longing to be a part of the child's life. One letter, dated just weeks before their wedding, was especially poignant. "I met someone who makes me believe in second chances, Margaret. She has a light in her that could banish even my darkest regrets. But I can't truly begin anew until I've found closure with you and our child. Please, if there's any part of you that still believes in me, write back." The lack of a reply among the letters was deafening. Eleanor realized that Henry must have carried the pain of silence for years, burying it beneath the happiness they built together. Yet his love for Margaret had been genuine, not a betrayal but a chapter that preceded her own. It was a difficult truth to face, but as she reread the letters, she found herself feeling less threatened by his past and more saddened by the weight he had borne alone. Her next step was the photograph. The woman standing beside Henry had a striking presence, tall, with dark hair cascading over her shoulders and eyes that seemed to hold secrets of their own. Eleanor turned the photograph over, hoping for a clue, and found an inscription in faint ink: "Margaret and Henry, 1961. A day to remember." Eleanor traced the words with her fingertips, the date aligning perfectly with Henry's confession. Eleanor decided to start her search locally. Henry had always said that some stories leave footprints, and she hoped his words would prove true. She began by visiting the town library, poring over old archives and records. It was slow, painstaking work, but Eleanor found solace in the quiet determination of her mission. She scanned newspapers, focusing on the early 1960s, and eventually stumbled upon a name: Margaret Collins. The name leapt off the page, accompanied by a photograph of Margaret volunteering at a community event in a neighboring town. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. It was the same woman from the photograph with Henry, her poised figure unmistakable even in the grainy black and white image. The article mentioned Margaret's involvement in local charities and hinted at her moving away abruptly in 1963. Eleanor's next step was to visit the town where Margaret had once lived. She called upon her old friend Martha for support, who, though skeptical at first, agreed to accompany her. "This is wild, Eleanor," Martha said as they drove through the winding roads. "But if anyone can get to the bottom of this, it's you." When they arrived, the town felt like stepping into a time capsule, its streets lined with historic homes and mom-and-pop shops that seemed untouched by the decades. Eleanor and Martha visited the local historical society, where an elderly archivist named Mr. Grant listened intently to Eleanor's story. He recognized Margaret's name immediately. "She was a lovely woman," Mr. Grant said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "I remember when she left. There was talk about her moving out west. Had a child, I think, but no one ever knew much about him. She kept to herself in her later years." The mention of the child sent a chill through Eleanor. "Do you know where she might have gone?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions within her. Mr. Grant rummaged through a file cabinet, eventually pulling out an old directory. "She had family in Portland," he said, handing Eleanor a slip of paper with a name and address scrawled on it. "This might be a good place to start." The drive back was quiet, both women lost in thought. Martha finally broke the silence. "You're really doing this," she said, a note of admiration in her voice. "You're chasing ghosts." "Not ghosts," Eleanor replied, clutching the paper in her lap. "Pieces of Henry. Pieces of my life I didn't know I was missing." That night, as Eleanor prepared for bed, she held a photograph of Margaret and Henry in her hands. She stared at their faces, imagining the life they might have shared before fate led Henry to her. It wasn't jealousy she felt anymore, but a strange sense of kinship. Margaret had loved Henry too, and now it was Eleanor's turn to find a child they had created, a child who might still be out there, carrying part Henry with them. When she finally drifted into sleep, Henry appeared in her dreams once again. This time his expression was softer, almost grateful. "You're doing the right thing," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Keep going." Eleanor woke with a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just uncovering Henry's past. She was building a bridge between two families, two lives, and two loves. And she knew, deep down, that wherever this journey led, it was exactly where she was meant to go. The slip of paper with Margaret's possible family connection in Portland felt like a lifeline and a leap into the unknown. Eleanor, who had lived her entire life within a 30-mile radius of her countryside home, was now preparing for a journey that would take her across states and decades of buried truths. She spent the evening packing a small bag, carefully tucking the letters, photograph, and Henry's note into a leather folder as though they were sacred relics. Her nerves trembled with equal parts anticipation and apprehension. Would Margaret's family welcome her? Would the child, now an adult, even want to know about Henry? The next morning, Martha arrived promptly, her car packed with snacks, a road map, and a dose of skepticism she couldn't entirely mask. "You know, Eleanor," she began as they pulled out of the driveway, "I've been your friend for 60 years, and this is the most adventurous thing I've ever seen you do. I half expected you to say you were joining the circus." Eleanor chuckled softly, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It's not about adventure, Martha. It's about doing what's right for Henry, for his child, and for myself. I can't let this mystery haunt me forever." The long drive to Portland was punctuated by periods of quiet reflection and bursts of conversation as the two women reminisced about their younger years. Eleanor found herself sharing memories of Henry she hadn't spoken of in years. How he proposed to her under the old oak tree behind her father's barn. How he'd surprised her with breakfast in bed on their anniversary. How he danced with her in the living room after his diagnosis, determined to give her one last moment of joy. The memories were bittersweet now, tinged with the weight of the secret he had carried, but they also reminded Eleanor of why she had loved him so fiercely. When they arrived in Portland, the city's energy felt almost overwhelming compared to the quiet countryside Eleanor was used to. The address Mr. Grant had provided led them to a modest suburban neighborhood, the kind where children's bicycles lay scattered on front lawns and porch swings creaked in the afternoon breeze. Eleanor's heart pounded as she approached the door of the small white house, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorbell. A woman in her 60s answered, her face lined with age but warm with curiosity. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice gentle but cautious. Eleanor hesitated, clutching the folder against her chest. "I'm sorry to intrude," she began, her voice steadier than she expected. "My name is Eleanor, and I believe you might be connected to someone I've been searching for. May I come in?" The woman's eyes narrowed slightly in confusion, but something in Eleanor's demeanor seemed to reassure her. She stepped aside, motioning for Eleanor and Martha to enter. They sat in a cozy living room filled with photographs and knickknacks, the air thick with unspoken questions. Eleanor unfolded the photograph of Margaret and Henry, placing it on the coffee table. "This is my late husband, Henry," she explained. "And this woman, Margaret, I believe she might be your relative. I've discovered letters that suggest she and Henry had a child together, and I've come to find out what became of them." The woman stared at the photograph, her expression softening into something unreadable. "Margaret was my sister," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "She passed away 10 years ago." Eleanor's chest tightened. "I'm so sorry for your loss," she said sincerely. "Did Margaret ever talk about Henry? Or about the child?" The woman, whose name was Helen, nodded slowly. "She did, but not often. She always said it was too painful to revisit. She moved here when her son David was about 5. She raised him alone, worked tirelessly to give him a good life. She never married again, but she always spoke of Henry with a certain fondness. She said he was the one who got away." The words hit Eleanor like a gust of wind, carrying both comfort and sorrow. She was relieved to know that Margaret had thought kindly of Henry, but the ache of his absence in their child's life lingered. "And David?" Eleanor asked cautiously. "Is he still?" Helen smiled softly. "He's very much alive. He's a teacher at the high school here, a wonderful man. Margaret was so proud of him." Eleanor's heart swelled and faltered all at once. Henry's child, his son, was alive out there, living a life shaped by Margaret's love and strength. The idea of meeting him filled her with both excitement and dread. What would she say? How could she possibly explain her presence in his life after all these years? Helen seemed to sense her hesitation. "Would you like me to reach out to him?" she offered. "David's a kind soul. I think he'd want to hear what you have to say." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight with emotion to speak. Helen picked up the phone, her calm voice carrying through the room as she spoke to her nephew. After a brief conversation, she hung up and turned back to Eleanor. "He'd like to meet you," she said. "Tomorrow, here at the house." Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She had come this far, and now she was on the brink of something monumental. A meeting that could redefine everything she thought she knew about her life and her husband's legacy. That night, as she lay in the guest room Helen had graciously offered, Eleanor stared at the photograph of Margaret and Henry. She whispered into the quiet darkness, "I hope I'm doing the right thing, Henry. I hope you're proud." Her dreams that night were peaceful, filled not with urgency, but with a sense of calm. Henry appeared once more, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're almost there," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Keep going." Eleanor woke with a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wasn't clear, but she knew one thing for certain. The journey she had begun was far from over, and the most important chapter was yet to unfold. Eleanor sat on the edge of the armchair in Helen's living room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for the man who was both a stranger and a link to Henry's past. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting soft patterns on the hardwood floor. Her heart raced as she tried to imagine what he would look like. Would he have Henry's sharp jawline, his warm brown eyes, or perhaps his infectious smile? She hadn't dared to think about the possibility until now, but as the clock ticked closer to their meeting, the thought consumed her. When the doorbell rang, Eleanor flinched, her breath catching in her throat. Helen gave her a reassuring smile and rose to answer it. A moment later, she returned with a man in his mid-50s. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with graying hair at his temples and a kind, open face. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. There was something of Henry in his eyes, a quiet depth, a gentleness that felt both familiar and jarring. "This is David," Helen said warmly, placing a hand on his arm. "David, this is Eleanor." David stepped forward, his gaze steady but curious. "It's nice to meet you," he said, his voice low and calm. He extended a hand, and Eleanor took it, her own trembling slightly as their palms met. "Thank you for coming," Eleanor said, her voice wavering but sincere. "I can't imagine what you must be thinking right now." David smiled faintly, taking a seat across from her. "Helen told me a little about why you're here. I'll admit, it's a lot to take in, but I'm here to listen." Eleanor nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She opened the leather folder on her lap and pulled out the photograph of Henry and Margaret, placing it on the table between them. David leaned forward, his brows furrowing as he studied the image. "That's my mother," he said softly, his voice tinged with a mix of surprise and nostalgia. "And this is Henry?" "Yes," Eleanor replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Henry was my husband. He passed away 10 years ago. I only recently discovered this photograph and the letters he wrote to your mother. He told me about you in a note I found after his death. I had no idea until now." David leaned back, his expression unreadable. "My mother mentioned Henry a few times when I was growing up," he said after a long pause. "She told me he was a good man, but that their lives were complicated. She said he didn't know about me, that she didn't tell him because she thought it was for the best." Eleanor's heart ached at the thought of Henry spending his life unaware of the son he had brought into the world. "He knew," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He found out, but by the time he did, your mother had already left. He searched for you, for both of you, but he never found you." It haunted him, David. He carried that weight with him every day. David's expression softened, his eyes glistening as he processed her words. "He searched for us," he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor nodded. "He loved you, even though he never met you. That love is what brought me here. Through dreams where he guided me to the truth. I know it sounds impossible, but it's the only way I can explain it." David was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photograph. "I grew up without knowing who my father was," he said finally, his voice steady but laced with a quiet pain. "I always wondered. I always felt like there was a part of me missing. But I never imagined I'd get answers like this." Helen reached over and placed a comforting hand on his arm. "You deserve to know, David," she said gently. "And Eleanor's here because she wants to help bridge that gap." Eleanor took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she reached for the letters. "These are Henry's letters to your mother," she said, holding them out to David. "They're yours now. I've read them, but they were meant for you." David took the letters, his hands steady despite the storm of emotions Eleanor could see swirling in his eyes. He held them for a moment before placing them gently on the table. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely audible. "This means more than I can put into words." The conversation that followed was one of shared memories and tentative connections. Eleanor spoke of Henry, the man she had loved, the life they had shared, and the pain he had carried. David, in turn, shared stories of Margaret, painting a picture of a strong, compassionate woman who had done everything she could to give him a good life. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow through the room, Eleanor felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The chasm between Henry's past and present was beginning to close, not with finality, but with a promise of something new, a bridge between two worlds that had once seemed irreparably divided. As David prepared to leave, he turned to Eleanor, his gaze steady. "Would you mind if I visited you sometime? I'd like to learn more about Henry, about my father. Eleanor's heart swelled with emotion, and she nodded, her eyes shimmering with tears. I would love that, she said, her voice thick with gratitude. That night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she felt Henry's presence more strongly than ever. His voice came to her in a dream, soft and full of pride. "You've done it, Eleanor," he said, his hand resting on hers. "You've given us the connection I always wanted but couldn't create myself. Thank you." Eleanor woke with a sense of fulfillment she hadn't felt in years. The journey wasn't over, but she knew she was no longer walking it alone. Together, she and David would honor Henry's legacy, bridging the gap between the past and the future in a way that was both healing and profound. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Eleanor had experienced in her 78 years. David visited her regularly, and with every conversation, she felt a deeper connection to him, not as a stranger or a reminder of Henry's hidden past, but as family. Together, they pieced together the fragments of Henry's life that had been scattered across decades, filling in the gaps with shared stories and new memories. They walked through her garden, the same one Henry had lovingly tended, and David marveled at how much of his own passion for plants seemed to echo the father he had never known. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor handed David Henry's old gardening hat. "He wore this every summer," she said with a soft smile. "It's yours now." David held it for a moment, running his fingers over the worn brim before placing it gently on his head. Eleanor laughed, a sound so pure and joyful it surprised even her. For the first time in years, her home felt alive, buzzing with a kind of warmth she had thought she'd lost forever. But as the days turned to weeks, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that there was still more to uncover. Henry's presence in her dreams, once so vivid, had begun to fade, replaced by a quieter, subtler sense of peace. Yet one final dream came, more vivid and urgent than any before it. In it, Henry stood beneath the old oak tree in her garden, the one where he had proposed to her so many years ago. This time, he wasn't alone. Beside him stood Margaret, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They both smiled at Eleanor, their faces filled with a calm understanding that seemed to transcend words. "Eleanor," Henry said, his voice clear and steady, "there's one more thing you need to do." Before she could ask what, he held out his hand, palm up, revealing a small object. It was the key, the same brass key she had found in the attic. She reached for it, but just as her fingers touched it, she woke with a start, her breath catching in her throat. The dream lingered in her mind as she went about her day, its message tantalizingly out of reach. The brass key had already opened the box that led to Henry's letters and Margaret's photograph. What could it possibly unlock now? She sat in her kitchen, the warm scent of fresh tea filling the air, and stared out at the oak tree. The answer, she realized, had been right in front of her all along. Eleanor called David, her voice trembling with excitement. "I need you to come over," she said. "There's something we need to do together." When David arrived, she led him to the oak tree, carrying a small spade and a brass key in her pocket. "This tree has always been special," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's where Henry proposed to me, and now I think he's leading us back to it for a reason." Together, they began digging at the base of the tree. The earth was soft, yielding easily to their efforts. After a few moments, David's spade hit something solid. He knelt down, brushing away the dirt with his hands, and uncovered a small metal box, weathered but intact. Eleanor's breath caught as she recognized the carvings on its surface. It matched the wooden box from the attic. With trembling hands, Eleanor used the brass key to open the box. Inside was a single envelope, addressed to my family in Henry's unmistakable handwriting. She hesitated for a moment, then handed it to David. "This is for you," she said softly. David unfolded the letter, his eyes scanning the words. As he read, his face shifted from confusion to understanding, and finally, to a deep, quiet emotion Eleanor couldn't quite place. He handed the letter to her, his voice thick with emotion. "You need to see this." Eleanor's hand shook as she read the letter. Henry had written it long ago, knowing it might never be found. He spoke of his love for Margaret and for Eleanor, acknowledging the complexities of his life and the mistakes he had made. But the letter held one final, unexpected revelation. David was not Henry's only child. "Eleanor," the letter read, "there is another truth I never had the courage to share. Before Margaret, before you, there was another, a brief, fleeting love that left me with a daughter. I tried to find her, but life pulled me in too many directions. If you're reading this, I ask one last favor. Bring them all together. Show them the love I couldn't give them myself." The weight of Henry's words settled over Eleanor like a heavy blanket. Another child, another life left untouched by the man she had loved so deeply. She looked at David, whose face mirrored her own mix of shock and determination. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling between them. Eleanor closed the box carefully, her gaze steady. "We honor his wish," she said firmly. "We find her, and we bring this family together, no matter how long it takes." That night, as Eleanor sat by the fire, her thoughts racing, she felt a sense of purpose stronger than anything she had known in years. The journey was far from over, but she no longer felt alone. Henry's love, though flawed and complicated, had brought them this far. It would guide them the rest of the way. When she finally drifted into sleep, Henry appeared one last time, his expression filled with pride and peace. "Thank you," he said, his voice a whisper carried on the wind. "You've given us all what I couldn't. Keep going, Eleanor. You've always had the strength." And with that, he faded into the light, leaving Eleanor with a heart full of hope and a future still waiting to unfold.